Welcome to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. I am your host, Molly Southgate, and today I'm interviewing...
Hi, I'm Stacy Stokes. I'm the author of The Darkness Rises.
Awesome. Hi, it's good to meet you, Stacy. Thank you so much for coming on today.
It's great to meet you too. Thank you for having me.
Can you tell me a little bit about what you've written?
Yes. So The Darkness Rises is a young adult speculative thriller. It is about a girl named Whitney who she can see dark clouds hovering over strangers' heads whenever they're in danger. So all her life, she has been saving people whenever she sees the clouds to prevent whatever horrible thing was about to happen, until she saves a boy from her school and he goes on to do something pretty terrible. And the book takes place a year later when she is trying to put the past behind her, keep the secret of the role that she played in her school's tragedy a secret, and also trying very hard to ignore the clouds that she keeps seeing over people's heads and finding that very challenging to do. And then she receives an ominous note in her locker that lets her know that somebody knows her secret, knows what she can do and what she did, and they want revenge. Dun, dun, dun.
That is such an interesting idea. I love the clouds over their heads, like that she's literally seeing that. Where did you get inspired to write about that?
Yeah, the clouds that so usually when I come up with a story idea, it kind of comes out of a weird nowhere place. I wish I could say that there's some process for development, but in this instance, I was cleaning my apartment and a line of text popped into my head that is now the opening to chapter 2. It used to actually be the opening to the entire book, and that is, I was 7 the first time I saw the darkness, and I stopped what I was doing. I was vacuuming or dusting or something, and I was just like, "What darkness? What in the world?" And started to think about it, and I knew pretty quickly that the concept for the book would be about a girl who could see darkness that told her when people were in danger. She was constantly saving people, and one day that saving people got her into trouble because she saved the wrong person.
Now, do you feel like when you have those flashes of inspiration, it usually comes to you as dialogue, or can it be characters, or even just the whole plot?
It's usually, this was the one instance of dialogue. It's usually a concept. So to give another example, my debut, Remember Me Gone, is also a speculative thriller. I'd say probably a little more of a mystery than a thriller. But that one, I don't know if you ever watched the show True Blood many years ago on HBO. It is a book. It's a story about vampires. Remember Me Gone is not about vampires, but there was an episode about the vampires could erase people's memories. And this one woman hired a vampire to erase her husband's PTSD from being in the war. And I remember it was just in that moment where I was like, wow, somebody should open a business like a memory house to take people's memories away and have people pay for them. And boom, it's like, wait a second, I could write that. And that became the concept for the book. So it's usually just either a line or a thought that tease up the concept, and then the plot and the characters take shape once I have that initial concept.
That is so cool. So you write a lot of paranormal type books, especially like what you're saying, lots of speculative things. Where do you look for paranormal content? Is that shows and movies, or is it something that you kind of like looking into the accounts that people have of interactions? Where does that land for you?
Yeah. Oh, I'd say in my personal entertainment and content devourment, is that a word? I don't know. in that, I tend to like paranormal and speculative things. So when I hear there's a book that has a speculative angle, when I hear there's a show that has a speculative angle or a magical angle, I'm usually all over it. So that is just sort of my natural preference. But if I had to think through what really sparked it, I grew up in a house full of books and reading. My mom was an avid reader, and she was a huge Stephen King fan. And well, first of all, she was never not without a book. There were books on the table, books in her handbag, books in her car. Like, she always had a book to read. So they were laying out all over the place. And I was told not to look inside the Stephen King books, which obviously, if you're a kid, you look inside whatever you're told not to look inside of. And I would read little snippets of it and sneak little snippets. And there's always something weird, paranormal, spooky, magical there. So that was sort of the first love of it. And then when I was in elementary school, like probably around like fifth or sixth grade, I discovered the young adult section of the bookstore. And those were the first books that I gravitated towards. It was always the ones where there was something magical, something paranormal. So it's in my content curation today, but it's always been there really since I started reading and became a fan of stories and books and knew from an early age that whatever I wrote, I wanted it to be like that and make me feel like that, like all those stories that I was reading.
I love that so much. I have almost the same exact story with the YA section in the library. I was like 10 years old and I discovered that this whole other side of the library existed. I never looked into before, and I just read endlessly.
Oh, it was magic. It was like a portal had been opened in the world. I will never forget the day that I found that first book that was it felt like it was written just for me.
So is that when you started writing, or did you start more after that?
Yeah, I started writing when I think I wrote my first story when I was 5 or 6. It was kindergarten or first grade. I mean, I used to put write in big quotes, like the giant
Mhm.
handwriting, like I walked down a sidewalk, I saw a cat kind of thing. But
Okay,
I
but wait, what was the story about?
I remember the assignment had to do with like write about a dream that you had. And I started writing about a dream, but then I just went off the rails and it was no longer about a dream. I was just making it up. And I think it was actually a ripoff of The Wizard of Oz. So I took my dream and turned it into The Wizard of Oz. Somewhere in a cedar chest, my mom has this story. But I remember the teacher making a big deal out of the fact that I was creative and writing. And I was like, huh, is this a special thing that I'm doing? I like doing this. I like the way it makes me feel. I like the way it makes other people feel. And I started writing stories, but I didn't really start thinking like I'm going to write a book until I discovered, I think, that young adult section, just like you did, and realized like, I could write stories about me, for me. And that has always stuck with me. That age group, that moment, that type of storytelling has just been sticky for me. I never grew up past it, I guess.
That is fantastic. Now, what does your setting building process look like? Because I know that these books are set more in our world, but because of these speculative elements, I mean, you still have to build out setting for that.
Yeah, it is very much. So far, I only ever done stories grounded in our world. So it's
Mhm.
more of how does this magical element fit into the world? Is it known or is it unknown? In the case of The Darkness Rises, it is very much an unknown element, right? It's a secret that Whitney has with her grandmother, who she calls Gans, and they don't talk about it because she's told at a very young age that people are afraid of the things that they don't understand. And this ability is something that people won't understand. So it's part of the world, but it's not a known part outside of those characters who are aware of it. But in my debut, Remember Me Gone, which deals with the memory taking power, it is a known ability because people come to the memory house to have their memories erased by the characters who live there and who have the ability. So there's a little bit of that playing with, is it known or is it unknown? And then what are the rules for how does it appear? How does it fit in the world? Where did it come from that you have to think through? But beyond that, the setting itself, most of my stories take place in Texas because that's where I grew up. And since I'm writing characters that are in high school, it's hard for me to break out of not picturing a little bit of my high school, a little bit of my town, a little bit of my experiences. Although I have a couple of works in progress that take place in California, which is where I live now. You can see behind me the trees of the Oakland Hills. I'm
It's
in.
beautiful.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, Northern California. So as of late, that beautiful setting has been creeping in, but so far most have been based in Texas.
nice. So you also have a background in improv, correct?
I do. Yeah, I lived in Chicago for many years. I
Oh,
went to.
that's where I'm from.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, such a fun town. I was there for 5 years. Have many happy memories, and improv is a big part of that. I was at the Second City for a number of years as a part of their conservatory program. I was with Improv Olympic, which is another improv group out there. So yes, improv is near and dear to my heart.
But I was going to ask if that's inspired your writing in any way. I feel like that quick pace of coming up with ideas, I could see that
Yeah,
impacting it.
I think it definitely has. It's not something overt where I've got an exercise that I do to help me with it that I learned in improv, but improv, just by nature of it, I mean, you are on a stage with no script with other people. And one of the things you learn early on is if you step onto that stage with a preconceived notion of what you're going to do, it's usually not that good, right? That's not that funny. It's not that interesting because you're almost trying too hard. The moments of magic and of real comedy happen when you step on the stage, you have no idea what's going to happen, and one of your teammates comes out and just says something to you and you react. And so I think there's a little bit of that in storytelling. It's good to have an idea of where you want to go, but also let yourself be surprised. Let yourself let the story kind of find you and explore a little bit. So one of the things I do whenever I'm stuck at a point in a story is just to try it. I try the opposite of what I was going to do. Like if the character was going to go right, I'm like, oh, what happens if they go left? And it's in those, let me just try the thing that I wasn't planning to do, that sometimes something really interesting happens. In my debut, Remember Me Gone, I remember I was really stuck in the middle of the book and I had my character the main character going to the love interest's house. I was like, this is not working. It's too soon for this big scene to happen. What if I had her go somewhere else? And she goes to the house of somebody who was originally just a very small side character. And that very small side character became a very big part of the story. And it really changed the direction. So my advice to any writers out there who are listening would be sometimes when you think you want to go right, just try it. Try going left and see what happens. You might be pleasantly surprised, but very much an improv, I guess, lesson.
That's an excellent lesson. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
So, I mean, that kind of brings up another question for me, which is, do you ever feel like your characters are calling the shots to say go right or go left, or is that all you?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I am not a plotter. I'm a pantser. So I just let the story kind of flow. And once I have a really good sense of who the character is, what they want, and just who they are as a person, it's hard not to let that take over. It's the moment where you break from yourself and what you would do and what your character would do. It's the moment that I know I've actually understood this person and their motivations, because you can't not let them take over because they're so wholly formed human beings that they make decisions the way that they make decisions, which means it's not the thing that I would choose to do. It's not how I would do things. So yeah, that's usually the moment when I know who they are and I'm on the right path because they're calling the shots to use your line.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's my favorite moment in my writing as well. A lot of the authors that I've interviewed have said that too, where it's you start to understand a character so well that you can just speak for them and they can speak through you.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Like we've been possessed by them.
Do you have any exercises or things that you do to get to that place?
Yeah, I guess a little bit. Really, the simplest one is I go for a walk. I find sometimes when you're sitting and you're trying really hard is the moment when stuff won't happen. But when like my body is moving, there's this freedom of my mind to operate. So a lot of times I will just go for a walk, put in music. Usually it's like classical music, just so I'm not getting distracted by lyrics, and just let my mind wander. And oftentimes in those, I will come unstuck or I'll come up with a new idea. The other thing is the old classic, keep a notebook by your bed, because that same moment of like your mind being free, I find a lot of times somehow in my sleep, I have a problem in the story or something I'm working through, and my brain is subconsciously working through it, and I have the solution. Ideally it would be in the morning when I wake up. But usually I wake up in the middle of the night. I have this.
Mhm.
If I don't write it down, it will fly from my mind because I'm still have the
That's the most writer thing ever, though, waking up in the middle of the night with your story idea that you have to write down.
Yeah, but I always think there's something about your finding a moment to let your mind just really work on it without sitting and forcing it. So go for a walk and hopefully dream the solution would be the best.
Kind of switching up what we're looking at here, I want to talk a little bit more about the professional side of things. What did your path to publication look like?
Yeah. So I think it was just based on other writer friends, pretty similar to theirs. Meaning, I got my lumps in the trenches, and it took several manuscripts to get there. But So as we talked about before, I've been writing kind of all my life, but it was probably about 15 years ago that I had an idea for a story that I was like, I think this might have potential. And I committed to, I'm going to sit down, I'm going to write a manuscript, and then I'm going to try to figure out what does it take to get published. Where before that, it was this dream. I had like half finished things that never really went anywhere, but this was, I'm going to commit, I'm going to try it. So I wrote that manuscript. I thought, hooray, what agent is going to take this? I will tell you now, it was terrible. No agent took it, nor should they have, because it was really bad. So as well, I did research to figure out how do you get published, learned that if you want to go the traditional path, you need to get an agent, which is what led me to just blindly query some agents. And then I realized this thing needs extra eyes. I need to learn how to fix this. So I discovered a number of different virtual online groups. At the time, there was a really good site called Agent Query Connect. It has since been taken down, but it was a forum where writers could connect with other writers. They had query workshops where you could workshop your query. I met a lot of writers through that. And I did a lot of beta reading and swapping manuscripts. And it was through that process that I really learned how to edit and how to take criticism and feedback. I ultimately joined a critique group that I'm still a part of to this day, which was really fun. I joined the critique group. None of us had agents or were published, and now most of us are agented, and many of us are published, which has been really, really cool to see. But so that first manuscript taught me the importance of getting feedback, but it still wasn't the book. So actually, the next one that I wrote and queried was a terrible draft of The Darkness Rises. I got feedback, I revised it, I queried it. It ultimately didn't get an agent, but I started to get those personalized messages back from agents that say, I'm onto something, but I still have work to do. And it wasn't ready yet. And that was around the time that I had the idea for what would become my debut book, Remember Me Gone. So I put The Darkness Rises in a drawer. I knew I wanted to finish it, but I just needed a break from it, and I needed time to figure out what that book was going to be. So I wrote Remember Me Gone. It took me several years to write that. And then I queried it, and I actually queried many of the same agents that I had queried with The Darkness Rises. And in fact, my current agent, Joanna McKenzie, was in the first batch of queries that I sent out, because I remembered while she rejected The Darkness Rises, it was a very nice, friendly note, and she had some good things to say. And I was hoping that somebody would let me pick that story back up. So I queried, I signed with Joanna, and we went out on submission, and it actually happened pretty quickly. 2 weeks after we went out on submission, we had an offer from my now publisher for 2 books. We actually submitted a couple of chapters of The Darkness Rises to that editor, and that's what turned it into a 2-book deal. So I'd say if I had to pull out themes again for any writers, it's number one, it takes a long time, it takes hard work. It's not going to be that very first draft. You got to learn how to take feedback, revise, keep revising, don't give up. And also, it's okay to walk away from a story that you love. Sometimes that's the best thing you can do, is to give it distance. And that story idea, and really the idea for The Darkness Rises around the dark clouds, is what stuck. I just needed to work the story around it to figure out what that could be.
I think that that is such a good message for young writers to hear too, that you wrote this book, you queried it, you got through the whole process, got rejected, you wrote another one, and then you were able to go back to that first book, and people were interested, and you were able to have that. Because I think as a young writer myself, it can get disheartening, and seeing my friends and everything, it's like, remember that if there's something there, if it's a good idea, it will come back and it will be out eventually.
Yeah, that's right. And I think figure out what it is about that story that you love, and what can you let go of. And don't be too precious about most of the things in the story. So for me, The Darkness Rises, I think what makes it an interesting concept is the speculative element, right? Her seeing the dark clouds. And I had that concept in there, but I just didn't have it in the right situation. So I was willing and able to let go of a lot of it. It took a long time, and there were a lot of drafts, many drafts. I don't even know how many drafts of this story I had before I was like, okay, this is the story. But figure out what it is that is the soul of the book to you, that you want to go back and write, and let go of the rest, and start thinking about the others. Or whether it's a character you love, what other situations could you put that character in? If it's a concept, could you put a different character in that concept and see something different happen? And that definitely helps let us give new life to manuscripts that maybe we put away because they weren't working, but we have love for.
Kind of along that same line, has there ever been a time where you had to really like kill your darlings? And if
Oh,
so, what was the big one? Because every author has a big one.
it's without, I don't want to give too much away about the book, but there were many, many darlings with The Darkness Rises. When I think about that first draft that got shelved and this story, really the only things that are the same, the main character, Whitney, the dance components, because I'd always wanted to write a dance book, having grown up and been a dancer. When I was in high school, I wanted that to be a part of it. And then her ability, and this idea of she could save people, but she saves the wrong person and something bad happens. It was those thematic concepts that stayed. The rest of it, there were many characters, there were many plot lines, there were many things that are no longer there. They are deleted, buried pages. So I think it goes back to that previous statement that I had around know what's the soul of it with you as a writer. Like if this went away, I literally would not want to write this book and let go of the rest of the story. And there are so many darlings that I can't even tell you which one, like what they were, because there were so many. So I guess maybe you said another way, it is find the true darlings. And there are fewer of them than you may think. Oftentimes we get really attached to say like a scene that we wrote beautifully. And if you can say, what is it about this scene that is really making me so proud? You can still keep those components while stripping off the rest. But sometimes it's hard to break from the whole to find the pieces.
For sure. For sure. So in these books, I know that you tackle a lot of serious issues, and bringing that to a YA audience has to be kind of tricky to do. What was that process like for you? And do you have any tips for authors looking to do it themselves?
Yeah, yeah. So it's on the cover, so it won't give anything away. Plus, I think it's important that readers know this book does involve a school shooting, and that is a pretty serious topic. The way that that element ended up in my book was actually from a personal place. I have not personally experienced a school shooting, but at the time when I was drafting and trying to figure out what could this book be, there had been another pretty horrific school shooting in the news, and my inclination was to turn off the news. I didn't want to look at it. I didn't want to see it. As a mother myself, it was this thing where I'm like, that's not in my world. That's not going to happen. And there was just this moment of me being like, wait a second, that is my world. This is the world we live in. It is pretty freaking awful. You can't just turn off the news and make it go away, right? That doesn't
Yeah.
make it go away. So, what ultimately happened to me is a lot of me processing my emotions about this world we live in, the world that I'm going to send my daughter into, the school situations that she could be dealing with. A lot of that grief and fear and terror is on the page, right? That is very real grief and fear and terror for me. And I think that was part of the unlock for this particular story was when it started to become me putting a little bit of myself on the page in addition to this character and those worlds merging, it became something more interesting and something more compelling. But I think you have to do that a little bit when you're dealing with tough topics. You can't just turn it into, well, I want to write about gun control, so I'm going to tell a story about a school shooting so that I can preach at the world. Nobody wants to read that book. What people want to read is those real, honest emotions. And so if you can find a way to tap into that, oftentimes you see authors who have lived and owned experiences writing about their own experiences, right? Those are beautiful, honest stories because they're putting themselves on the page. And in this instance, I'm putting a lot of myself on the page. So I think that
Mhm.
helped quite a bit in dealing with a tough topic because it came from an honest place, not a preachy place, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think it's also so important to be bringing and discussing these issues with the younger audience because that's a large portion of who it's affecting. And these kids, I mean, we're the ones that are scared about this, and because it's our reality. And having a book you can look at and go, oh, it's a fun book. It's a speculative fiction. I get to hear about this character, but I also get to have my worries addressed, and I get to see how they handled it. And you're not being talked down to. And I think that's a very noble cause and a very important thing to write about.
No, yeah. One of the things I love about speculative fiction, fantasy, whatever the magical genre is it allows us to look at difficult things, but almost at a safe distance, right? You can explore it because it's in a world where something magical exists. So it almost creates a little bit of a safe barrier for you to poke it and prod it and explore. How do I feel about that? What does it look like? And that's the beauty of books, I think, is
Mhm.
they allow us to explore things that are scary, things that we are trying to deal with, things that we don't know how to come to terms with, things that we're trying to understand in the world in a safe way, in a distanced way, and that's healthy. I think that's not just escapism, but that's exploration, and
Yes.
in a very complicated and scary world.
I think it's necessary too.
Yeah,
I think it's necessary for us as humans to be able to have that outlet and have that place. Kind of. So, have you read a book that did that for you? And would you mind sharing a few titles?
yeah. I mean, so many books. So I'm trying to think of issue topic. And there's two different sides of me. One is my absolute favorite books in the world, which I gravitate very much towards speculative books. I love anything by Maggie Stiefvater, and The Scorpio Races is probably one of my all-time favorite books. And I was trying to think through, did that deal with any issues? And actually, as I'm thinking out loud, it did, because that is a book about grief. It is a book
Mm.
dealing with somebody finding their independence in the world and their place in the world. So that very much, when I read that book, I had just moved to a new city. I didn't know anyone. So here's this person going through a different kind of loss and a different kind of grief while also trying to figure out their place in the world and make their place in the world. So I think the underlying themes definitely spoke to me, all in a wrapper of a really interesting speculative story about magical water horses that eat people, which, if you haven't read the book, it is very cool. It's a cool concept, and it's also beautifully written, as anything by Maggie Stiefvater is.
I will definitely have to check that out. Thank you for the recommendation.
Yes, and I'm filtering because I could probably fill up another whole half hour of just listing books that I love and how they've impacted me.
Well, if you want to share a couple more, you are welcome to.
Yeah, the other one that I would say, The Book of M by Peng Shepherd. It's not a YA book, it's an adult book, but that one is a really interesting story that at the core deals with memory loss, but it's a speculative world where people are losing their shadows. And when they lose their shadows, it starts to eat away at their memory. But it's a beautifully done concept. And for me personally, while this is not the intent of the story, as you watch members of your family get older, loss of memory is often a very real thing that you have to deal with, that many of us will face. And that book, in many ways, helped me to see how do you interact with somebody as they are going through memory loss, and you have that frustration of dealing with it, even though that is not the core of the story. It's a really just cool concept about shadows and the impact of that in this kind of post-apocalyptic, interesting world. But again, just a beautiful theme that helped me think about things and deal with things in an unexpected way.
That's beautiful. And I think as a writer, that's like the best you can ask for is
Right.
that you will write a book and someone will interpret it and find meaning like that directly applies to their life, even if it's not something you were trying to put into the book.
Right. Yeah, definitely. Those are the ones that stick with us.
Hmm. Well, I have had an absolutely incredible time interviewing you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been wonderful.
I just have one last question, and that is, what do you have coming up?
Well, I, of course, have The Darkness Rises launching on April 9th. So if anybody thinks that sounds good to them, I would love it if you would pick it up, leave a review, check it out from your library, however you acquire books. So that is in the immediate future. And then I have a number of projects that I'm working on. One that I'm really excited about is it's my first attempt into middle grade and a younger voice, but I have always wanted to write a really scary book for kids. So I am doing my first attempt at a really scary book for kids. So we'll see that it's about a vengeful shadow who's looking for a playmate. So we'll see how that goes.
Oh, that is fantastic. Okay, I cannot wait to read that and all of your books. Everyone listening to this, please go buy all of the books, support Stacy Stokes and all of these fantastic stories. For Read Between the Lines, my name is Molly Southgate.
And I'm Stacy Stokes.
Let's end this the way all great stories end. Happily ever after. The end.
Thank you for listening to Read Between the Lines, a book podcast. You can follow the show on Instagram and Facebook at Read Between the Lines Podcast and on Twitter at RBTL Podcast. Make sure to follow the authors who I've been talking to hear all about their upcoming projects, and also because they're cool people. This show is hosted by me, Molly Southgate, and produced and edited by my dad, Rob Southgate. Read Between the Lines is a Southgate Media Group production, and you can find all the great content put on by the network at southgatemediagroup.com. You can read the story of how I and many other podcasters started in the anthology book Pod Life, which you'll find at the link in the show notes. Also in the show notes are links to buy the books featured on this episode. Using those links supports this show and the incredible authors being interviewed. Have a great week and keep reading.